Welcome to our webinar on advances in employee impairment detection before accidents happen. This is Karen O'Hara. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications with WorkCare and your moderator for today's session. Thanks so much for joining us. We're excited to present this webinar today. It's a really interesting topic. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. The webinar will last for 1 hour. The session is being recorded and will be available within 24 hours or so on our YouTube channel. You'll be able to find a link to the channel on our website, which is workcare.com. During the webinar, you'll be on mute. We'll take questions at the end of the presentation. Please submit your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom, and I'll be monitoring your questions throughout the session, and we'll answer as many as we can as time allows. And now I'd like to introduce our presenters, the two Jeffs. First, you'll be hearing from Jeffrey Jacobs, MD, MPH. Dr. Jacobs is Vice President of our Medical Exams and Travel Division, where he's responsible for clinical oversight of our medical surveillance programs. Dr. Jacobs is board certified in occupational medicine, and he has a particular interest in impairment determinations. Some of you may have attended his webinar on the impact of recreational and medicinal marijuana in the workplace. And if you missed that one, you can find it on our YouTube channel and our website. Our other speaker, Jeff Cease, is Chief Operating Officer at Predictive Safety, which has developed technology to assess worker alertness to help prevent accidents, injuries, and fatalities. He's one of the founders of the company, and he's been working in the field of fatigue management and impairment detection for 15 years. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Jacobs. He'll turn it over to Jeff S. And then Dr. Jacobs will wrap up and we'll take questions.
Thanks, Karen.
Again for joining us. Dr. Jacobs?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. When you said the two Jeffs, I had made a little joke to Jeff Cease before, and I asked him if anybody had seen the sequel to Chinatown. And it was called The Two Jakes, and it was a terrible movie. But I want to assure you that this sequel to last year's marijuana talk and impairment will be quite boffo at the box office, and you will remember the two Jeffs. So if you can advance to the next slide, Alexis, please. So last year and the prior years in June, I've given a talk on drug testing. And at the end of last year's talk, I really started to focus on impairment in the workplace. And so today I'd like for us to consider moving beyond drug testing as the primary means of determining employee impairment. I'd like us to learn some cutting edge screening and assessment tools to assess impairment in the workplace. And then I'd like to go into a little bit of detail on the steps that supervisors should take when confronted with potentially impaired employees. So if you could pop to the next one. Thanks. So I don't have to tell you this, but injuries are costly, whether it's for medical care or lost time, absenteeism or presenteeism. It costs U.S. businesses an estimated $1 billion or more a week in dealing with injuries, and they span the gamut from handling objects to falling to being hit by objects, awkward postures, crashes, slip, trips, and falls, etc. So if you transition to the next slide. This is an example of one such workplace unintentional accident or injury. Someone that was using the excavator that you can see in the middle of the picture there, clearing out a building next to a Salvation Army thrift store in Philadelphia in 2013, just about this time, 9 years ago. And they went through a wall, and the building collapsed and fell on the thrift store, injuring 12 and killing 6. The crane operator was found to have marijuana and opioids in a post-accident blood screen. The contractor was given a 15 to 30-year prison term. The excavator was given 7.5 to 15-year prison term. It cost $300,000 in fines to OSHA, and they had to settle with the victims for over $200 million. Clearly, something that nobody who woke up that day thought that this was going to happen, and you can't turn back the clock. And you just wonder, would it have mattered if the crane operator was known to be impaired prior to getting into that crane that day? Next slide, please. So here's another study. It was done in the early 2000s by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. It's called the Large Truck Crash Causation Study. And the driver was found to be responsible for close to 90% of all crashes. And in some cases, the driver panicked or overcompensated, but in 10% of the cases, the driver had some obvious sign of impairment, whether they fell asleep or were disabled by a heart attack or a seizure, or were physically impaired for another reason. But if you look at the 28% recognition portion of this, that people were inattentive or distracted, I mean, that's also some form of impairment too. So I would argue that impairment plays a big role in many of the accidents that we see in the workplace. Next slide, please. So what is impairment? From the National Safety Council, and I would urge people to go to their website and take a look at a lot of this stuff. They have really great material there. It's the inability to function normally or safely from a change in behavior. And it can be as a result of chemical substances, physical factors, or social factors. And I'll describe a little bit more in the next couple slides. Next slide. Thank you. So we focus on substance use as a major cause of impairment, and it does play a role, whether it's alcohol or prescription medications like opioids or stimulants, medical marijuana or recreational marijuana, over-the-counter medications like Benadryl can cause sedation and impairment. But it could also be because of mental and physical fatigue, sleep loss, people who perform overnight work, or people who have physically demanding jobs may be inattentive. Mental illness can play a role. Stress can play a role. Uncompensated medical diseases can play a role. Things like diabetes or seizures or heart disease, and also extreme conditions like hot and cold and humidity. And it's important to realize that knowing the cause of impairment isn't necessary to respond appropriately. Next slide, please. So why is this important to me? My job is looking at workplace safety and doing fitness for duty evaluations on people, whether that's a pre-placement exam or a true fitness for duty exam, a return to work exam, or just a drug screen. I'm trying to determine if a person is physically fit and safe to work. And impairment affects the person's ability to function safely by reducing their ability to think clearly or concentrate, to evaluate decisions and make the appropriate decisions in a split-second manner. For instance, in driving. So you have decreased coordination and reaction time. It may just be changes that you notice in somebody's personality or mood, that they're more irritable, And you also can see it in workplace performance. People are absent more frequently, or when they're at work, they're not really at work. They're somewhere else in their head. You see a reduced quality of work and inattention to detail, where you had a good worker previously, suddenly they're just not right. Next slide, please. So the fitness for duty exam is what I do, and it's the ability to perform the essential job duties. Per the National Safety Council, they look at the physical, mental, and emotional realms of work. And basically, we want to make sure that employees are fit for duty, especially in safety-sensitive positions, such as heavy equipment operators, hazardous chemical handlers, drivers, and individuals that are responsible for the health and safety of others. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn it off to the Jack Nicholson of this team, Jeff Cease.
Well, thank you, Dr. Jacobs. I really appreciate it. So yeah, just to kind of get started here, Dr. Jacobs covered a couple of really key points. He talked about the various types of impairments, of which substances and alcohol are just one of many types of impairments. And he also talked about fitness for duty. And traditionally, a fit for duty test or fit for duty exam is something that might happen once a year. Can you lift the 50-pound bag? Can you do the things that are key? But the reality of the world is are you fit for duty every day? And when you start looking at impairment and all the other causality for impairment outside of substances and alcohol, what if there was a way to have a top-level screen, a top-level screen that was sensitive to impairment and empowered leaders within the organization to have objective conversations with folks and be able to discover the potential hazards before they happened. And that's really what I'm going to talk about now. And I'm going to move through a fair amount of information here. And what I want to encourage folks to do is ask questions at the end of this session. But if you have additional questions on this technology, please connect up with your work care representative, and we'd be very happy to go and take a much deeper dive. So let's go ahead and get started here. So in this section, we've got some quick objectives that we're going to go over, and we're going to take a look at the factors that are leading to the adoption of impairment testing. A lot of different things that have been happening in the employment space recently. We're going to understand the science behind it, and we're going to see the difference that impairment testing can make in the workplace with a couple of case examples. Go to the next slide. So why are companies considering impairment detection technology? What's driving this? Well, there's a few factors, and Alexis, if you want to go to the next slide here. Fatigue is a big one. And fatigue, if you look at this little picture graph on the left-hand side, all of these things are things that Dr. Jacobs already mentioned. And fatigue is a huge thing. And it's been really under the covers, and people don't really recognize it, other than the fact that it's not regulated. With drugs and alcohol, you have regulations. If you're if you have CDL drivers, you have regulations to deal with fatigue. If you're in the mining, or not with fatigue, but to deal with impairment from drugs and alcohol. If you're in the mining industry, fatigue is a huge deal in the mining industry. But if you talk to MSHA, they just know, well, it exists. But when you start to look at the root cause of accidents in the mining industry, what you find is that fatigue is the root cause of many of those accidents. And you see all the types of things that happens, whether it's impaired memory, risky behavior, reduced physical capacity. These are a big deal, but it's also, home life work balance. It's second and third jobs. There's all these things that drive fatigue, and the root of the science behind impairment testing really is around testing for fatigue, which is a much finer impairment to be able to detect than a lot of things that you might have with drugs and alcohol. We'll go to the next slide. So mental health is driving the adoption of this. Particularly with COVID, there's been increasing suicide rates, increasing use of antidepressants and anxiety medication. I'm sure some of you are seeing the impact of fentanyl in your workplaces right now, and trying to figure out how do we deal with that. Not only is marijuana legalized, the usage of marijuana is really on the rise for recreational use. So now you've kind of got the double whammy there, and depending on what state you happen to be in, you may not even have the ability to test for THC. So all sorts of things are starting to happen that is impacting people's mental health. And these are things that can result in impairment and ultimately injury and accident within the workplace. Go to the next slide. So legalize marijuana, as I just mentioned, right? It's still illegal now, illegal in only 4 states. And there's all sorts of legal challenges that are starting to crop up that are associated with legalized marijuana based on THC causativity. And the legislation from state to state is all over the board. People are really struggling, trying to figure out how to deal with the fact that now, not only am I not allowed to test for THC on pre-employment, I'm not allowed to test for it on a random, and I'm not allowed to terminate employment based on somebody, having THC in their blood. So we have to rethink the way that we're dealing with people, and people are looking at legalized marijuana much more today like alcohol than they ever have in the past. And so we kind of figured out how to get over that hurdle with alcohol. So now we got to figure out how to get over that hurdle with legalized marijuana as well. Next slide. And so how do you balance workplace safety with employee rights? If you guys have operations in New York or Nevada, you're probably well aware of this. New Jersey is coming up with all sorts of creative things that are going on. We're going to talk about that in a minute. I'm actually based in Colorado, so we've been through this since the very beginning. It's been really quite fascinating. And if you look at some of these headlines over here on the left, right? DC lawmakers pass a bill that would ban firing employees for failed tests on marijuana. Okay, well, if you operate in DC, that's going to impact you. New Jersey employers need to have a special expert sign off. That means you have to hire somebody that has a skill set that's very similar to a policeman's skill set, a workplace impairment recognition expert. That's going to cost companies money to do that. People are getting sued if they terminate somebody over a positive marijuana test with Amazon and with Kmart. And again, Rhode Island legalizes recreational marijuana and protects off-duty use. Meaning if you smoke off the job, what happens if you come into work high? How do employers deal with that? And how do you determine if somebody is high or not? Particularly if you're in a state where you can't test for THC as a deterring factor. Go to the next slide. When you start looking at impairment and you look at the risk profile behind impairment, it's all of these things, right? And again, just reiterating what Dr. Jacobs said, it's a lot of stuff on impairment. And that's really what's driving, the interest in this type of technology. Let's go to the next slide. Plus, impairment is financial risk. And this is a big deal. As Dr. Jacobs said, the cost of these incidents can be extreme. And it goes beyond just the cost of the incident. It goes to quality control. It goes to the reputation of the company. Again, if you're a contractor in the mining industry and you have a fatality on a mine site, you might never get work again, at least at that mine, maybe even in the industry. Productivity is a huge deal. Multi-million-dollar lawsuits because of injury that potentially could have been avoided if a supervisor or a manager had been able to pick up on the fact that this person that's operating the crane is off today, that they're not behaving like they normally behave. Cost of workers' comp and insurance rates continue to go on the rise. So what can we do to combat all of this? Go to the next slide. So what we're doing is companies are starting to expand their thinking to look at the whole person, as opposed to just looking at the metabolites that are in their blood on a random basis. So the real bottom line is, are you fit to work today? Back to Dr. Jacobs' last slide on fit for work. It's now starting to look at, how do I look today? Am I high in the moment? I might have smoked marijuana on Friday night, but now I'm on Monday. And am I high? Am I still high from Friday night? Doubtfully. Do I have metabolites in my blood? Most definitely. So we've got to look at all of this in a very different way. And really what we're starting to see, and one of our clients that we work with is a global construction company, and they're building all over the world. And they're really struggling with the fact that drug testing isn't doing the job for them. And what they're saying to their folks is, we care about you, not your lifestyle. It's a very different way of thinking, and it's starting to become more prevalent out in the workplace. Go to the next slide. Okay, So let me give a quick introduction to this video. This is a gentleman who was invited to speak at the New Jersey Business and Industry Association conference on legalized marijuana. And in that meeting, they had a number of legislators, they had attorneys, they had a bunch of folks that are trying to figure out how to deal with legalized marijuana. And they invited this gentleman in. His name is Tanner Hickman. He's the vice president of safety with a company called Triple S Steel, to talk about the impact that impairment testing has had within their organization. They have facilities all over the country. And unfortunately, he wasn't able to attend the meeting in person. They had an emergency that day, but he did speak from his car. So the video is a little herky-jerky because it's coming over a Zoom connection, but I think the content is pretty impactful. So Alexis, if you want to go ahead and start the video.
Well, fast forward, about 2014-ish or so, it was very difficult to find applicants that could pass the test with the cannabis part. At the time, there was a study in Colorado by the University of Colorado that said that 3 out of 5 males between the ages of 18 and 30 ingested marijuana on a regular basis. Well, you can imagine the demographic in our steel yard of the labor force was males between the ages of 18 and 30. So that told me that 3 out of 5 of our guys were out there using marijuana, the ones that did get through the pre-employment testing. So I started looking for a solution, and all the things that you guys have been talking about the law enforcement style of detecting impairment is all good, but it's very subjective. And when you're a human being, I don't care how well you're trained or how neutral or objective you think you're being, there are things, in my belief, that humans can be very subjective on. And one of those is impairment. So as you all know, there is no universally accepted scientific way to detect someone being high on cannabis in the moment. That's a no-brainer. If he's on his way to work this morning and his spouse says, you know what, when you get home this evening, all your stuff's going to be in the driveway and you can find somewhere else to live. Then he pulls into a parking spot at Triple S. He's going to go operate our 50-ton crane. Is he on drugs or alcohol? No, he's not. And we'd already been training our leadership and supervisors on reasonable suspicion and trying to, recognize behavior that wasn't normal. Again, very subjective way of recognizing that. So what this tool does is it raises that flag from a totally objective perspective, and it gets a conversation going. It doesn't tell you what the impairment is. You do have to sit down with the individual and go through, some certain steps. And what we did is we molded that conversation around the DOT reasonable suspicion training, which we'd already been doing with our truck drivers. And we learned that when we walk into these conversations, we don't walk in there with guns blazing. Somebody mentioned an axe versus a scalpel. We definitely use a scalpel in these conversations. We don't go in there with our guns blazing, saying, what have you been smoking or what have you been drinking? We understand now that some of these folks are going through some really hard times. At the end of the day, I really believe this is the wave of the future. I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel. I don't think that we need cops in the workplace or anything like that. I think that this needs to be one of those deals where people are going to have to understand that the green wave is coming, and it's obviously already in New Jersey. And there is a way to get through this. And then obviously, this allows, and this is kind of an unspoken thing, this allows cannabis users to use cannabis, just not at work. And we have, if we have a conversation and we believe that there's drugs or alcohol, we will take them down to the clinic and have them tested. And if they do test positive, then we go down that road. However, in every other instance, we try to make sure that we take care of the employee. If they need some help, in their personal life, what have you, we will do whatever.
Thank you. So this is just a snippet of a much larger conversation. And if you're interested in seeing the entire video, it's available on our website. It's also available out on YouTube. There's the whole meeting is out there, but it's pretty fascinating to hear how businesses are trying to deal with this whole legalized marijuana issue. Let's go to the next slide, Alexis. You got to click past this one more time. There we go. So what's the science behind impairment testing? We're going to do a real quick review on this. And again, as I mentioned earlier, if people want to take a deeper dive, will be available. Let's go to the next slide, Alexis. Well, first of all, we need to understand what needs to be evaluated, okay? So when you look at cognitive processes and you look at impairment, the things that we need to look at is ability to make decisions correctly and consistently, pattern recognition, processing speed, reasoning, attention, perception, and memory. These are the key cognitive processes that need to be evaluated in order to have an effective impairment test. The trick is, how do we do that quickly and through a tool that's going to be consistent and people that like to use this. Let's go to the next slide. Well, it's actually, the concept began way back when with NASA. That picture on the left is a photograph of an astronaut way back on Skylab. And she's using a little device called a PVT 192. And really that was invented back in the 60s. And it's a reaction time test. So numbers will start spinning on this thing. And as soon as you see the numbers spinning, you have to push a button. Then they spin again and you have to push a button. And it basically, it assesses your behavior alertness and through a sustained attention demand test. The key on this is it's free of aptitude effects. So it doesn't really matter, you know, where you're at, you know, how good are you, because it's just simply running for everybody kind of similar, right? These PVT tests have been proven scientifically to be sensitive to sleep loss, sleep pathology, and particularly functioning in an adverse circadian phase, which means think about night shift workers switching to day and things like that. But this is really deeply established science. The problem with this science is most of these PVT tests, including this one from way back when, would take anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes to execute. Well, that's not going to be very effective in a commercial environment. And so there had to be some changes made in order to make this type of testing for a cognitive test to be more effective. Let's go to the next screen. Okay. So in comes Niosh, and Niosh basically said, if you want to have an impairment test, it must be short and not significantly delay the start of work. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with Niosh, National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. They say a 2-minute test is acceptable. A 5 to 10-minute test is not acceptable. The test should not depend on language skill or be excessively difficult. So it needs to be something that everybody can do, and it's not going to be non-discriminatory. That's one of the real key things when we start talking about these types of alertness and fatigue and impairment tests. And the test must be valid and reliable in detecting impairment. So those were the key factors that Niosh was saying that needed to be done. If we go to the next slide. And what were some of the considerations for applicability? Okay, well, and the impairment test we're going to show you is called AlertMeter, and it was developed under a grant from Niosh. So I want to be really clear on this. So all of these things you're seeing here are directly applicable to the AlertMeter impairment testing solution. So considerations for applicability for an impairment test is it had to have validated science with clinical and peer-reviewed evidence, right? It has to be non-discriminatory, language independent, and it should only have a minimum of personally identifiable information, meaning a good impairment test can't have HIPAA type information in it. It doesn't care what your weight is. It doesn't care how old you are. It doesn't care, what your background is, your demographics. It just simply knows who you are. And it needs to gather whether you're impaired or not based on the utilization of the impairment test, not based on any other personal medical factors. Okay, really clear on that. Okay, needs to be quick and easy to execute, and it needs to have robust management and monitoring notification tools. Doesn't do you much good if somebody just comes in and plays a little 60-second game, and if they struggle with it, nobody knows. You've got to have tools behind that to be able to help connect people when people are struggling. Non-expensive hardware, meaning one of the key factors on this is it needs to run on equipment you guys already have. So you don't have to buy a special device. If you got iPads or mobile devices or computer desktops, it needs to run on all of those types of platforms, independent of what the operating system is, whether it's Android or iOS or any of those types of things. So no expensive hardware. And finally, a low annoyance factor, something that people aren't going to get pissed off about that they have to do this every day when they come to work. And that's the key, is this is a everyday fitness for duty test that's a top level screen for cognitive capability today. Where's my head at today? How am I performing today compared to how I normally perform? And that's really the core element behind this concept. Let's go to the next slide. So what is this and how does it work, right? So you can see this picture on the screen. You see a series of shapes on the screen. And the challenge is really quite simple. Are all the shapes the same, or is one of them different? And Alexis, if you could just click, there'll be a little animation that'll come up. And what it's looking at is all those things I mentioned earlier: reaction time. How quickly can I respond to this screen? And notice, are all the shapes the same, or is one of them different? And so the challenge is really simple. Here we're selecting the one shape that's different, and we just touch that button. And you see that little countdown timer that's going in the blue circle there. That's going to count down anywhere from 5 to 6 seconds per screen. So you have a challenge that you have to complete this assessment before that countdown timer pops on. It also is checking your working memory, as you're going to see in a minute in another quick video, how well you do against these different shapes. Some people do well with the circles, other people do well with the squares. And the key element is it starts to learn how you behave, because as it says in the title, it is a baseline psychomotor vigilance test, alertness evaluation. And the key aspect is the baseline concept. So you play the game and it starts to create a baseline. You play it again, and now you have a baseline. And that baseline is all the way down at the shape level. So what you see in this last little graph is it's showing you where you scored in the red those 2 times in a row. That person was struggling that day, and the result of that is they had a conversation with their manager. Where it's in the green, they came in, they played their 60-second game, and they moved on. So let's go to the next slide. It also works in a mobile app. So same concept, are they all the same, or is one of them different? And both apps include this memory function. So you see a shape and you have to memorize that shape, do a few more same or different screens, and then you have to recall the shape that you memorized. And so what that's doing is not only is it checking your short-term memory, think about the impacts of marijuana, it's also checking your ability to switch executive functions from this decision-making concept to this memory concept. And so there's all these different scientific elements that are built into these applications. As I mentioned earlier, if people want more information on the science, we'll be happy to go into that. Next slide, please. And really, where did this come about? Well, what's fascinating, particularly with the alert meter, is that was invented as a direct response to the Exxon Valdez incident. The inventor of this application was in the maritime industry when the incident happened. And for those of you that aren't familiar with it, the vessel pilot of that tanker was slightly hungover and hadn't had enough sleep the night before. So the inventor of the alert meter went to NASA and they asked them, what do you guys do to check for impairment? NASA shared the concept of the psychomotor vigilance test. Remember that PDT 192, that little thing that person was doing with the numbers. So the inventor of the alert meter, he went to Niosh, National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, and he said, hey, I got this great idea. Doesn't work in a commercial environment using a psychomotor vigilance test. Let's create a new concept behind impairment testing. So received significant funding from Niosh to create what is today the alert meter. And then that's been getting field tested down in the South African mining environment for the last 10 years. And today we have over 80 million worker hours on this system and lots of clinical data, lots of studies that have been done, 11 patents, 4 more are pending. And we really held off on bringing this to market until all the science and the background and everything was done. And we could be confident that 99% of the population could effectively execute this impairment test in a non-discriminatory fashion and create conversations that wouldn't have happened otherwise. And that's really the goal behind this, is those conversations. Let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. Okay, so what are we doing? We're evaluating consistent cognitive behavior. And as I mentioned earlier, it learns each person's behavior patterns. So for me, those shapes that are in the green, I would see those as difficult. And the result being that it might take me 5 seconds and I might get them right 10% of the time. But Dr. Jacobs, when he sees those shapes that are in the green, he might get those correct in 2 seconds and get them right 90% of the time. The end of the story there is that you could still score 100% accurate, but still get a red score because your behavior today at these shape levels is significantly different. It gets to the point where it actually creates a brain print. And you could, even if you handed your phone to your buddy or you had somebody that took the test under your login, it would actually score them in the red, or it would pop up a message that says suspected other user, because their behavior against these specific shapes is so different. And it never compares results between individuals. You're only being compared against your own personal baseline. Let's go to the next slide. And so one of the things that happens with this is, as you play the game more often, the game gets better at recognizing you and you get better at playing the game. And the result is we start to get to a very high level of statistical relevancy when somebody scores outside of their normal range, and that being that their score below their baseline level to a significant extent. And that's what those two little X's are. And that's when this system will generate a notification that will go to a manager, or it'll go to a safety director, or it may go to your MRO. There's lots of ways to handle that. But the whole idea is top level screen indicates potential impairment, creates a conversation where then that is verified. Are you good to work today? Did you get enough rest? And we make decisions based on the conversation, not on the alert meter. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so there's lots of ways that these are put into production, whether it's tablets in a vehicle, whether it's tablets that people can do, near where they clock in for work. And one of the other key things, if you see that picture on the right, the guy drinking the water, is a big aspect of this type of impairment testing is personal feedback. You know what? I scored down low to the yellow zone today. I'm going to grab an extra bottle of water before I go out on the tractor. I'm going to remember to take an extra break, or maybe dispatch is going to check in with me a little more often. There's lots of ways to manage fatigue and other factors just by being aware of it. Awareness is 90% of the deal, and personal awareness of the fatigue risk is a big, big deal. Next slide, please. So basically, real simple, you play the game at the beginning of the shift. It takes 60 seconds. It evaluates your alertness compared to your personal baseline. 99.9% of the time, people are good, but about 1% of them will score in the red 2 times in a row. If that happens, a designated supervisor or manager on duty will receive an email or text, and policy says that I need to go speak to my manager. And the supervisor is then going to follow a company protocol to address potential impairment and determine if there's something here that we need to be concerned about. Let's go to the next slide. So you're going to reduce exposure, right? Because you're going to generate objective conversations that may not occur otherwise, okay? And really the second point, I'm going to actually read the slide. I don't usually do that, but providing an objective assessment to replace subjective observations that often require courage that frontline managers may lack. So think about a frontline manager, he's 28 years old, just got promoted, and he's got a 30-year veteran on his crew, and he spots that 30-year veteran behaving somewhat abnormally. Think about the courage that it takes to approach this person and say, hey, I'm worried about you, let's have a chat. And the courage that it takes to not be afraid of somebody coming back at him and saying, what's your problem? You're brand new here, and what, you got an issue with my bandana, whatever it is. So being able to give an objective tool to frontline managers to create those conversations is really the root cause, or the root thing that we want to do to help your company reduce their exposure to risk. Next slide, please. And also being able to use data to drive solutions within the organization. Here we see a higher incident of people struggling on the alertness test around key times of the year. You could replace this chart with data from one facility to another. Which facility is generating the highest number of, we call them outside normal range results, and start to manage your facilities or your crews based on the cognitive awareness of the folks that are coming in and out of the facility. So there's lots of data that can be used here. Next slide. And ultimately, it's what can we bring to the bottom line for the corporation. You can see that area in the circle. This is quite the eye chart. Again, we'd be happy to send this to folks. But this is really a compilation of case studies that have been done, whether we're looking at reduction in workers' comp or auto liability or general liability, the average cost per incident, auto vehicle incident rates. And you can see here that on almost every category, we're bringing all of those key metrics down at a minimum of 20%, sometimes over 30, sometimes over 40. We even have one on here where they brought their workers' comp claims down 70%, 50% the first year and 20% the second year after implementing this alert meter technology and removing THC from their pre-employment screen and removing random drug testing entirely within their organization. Not that we recommend that, that's your call, but that's what they did. And they had a huge improvement in both morale, employee retention, and improvement in workers' comp. Let's go to the next slide. So the leadership feedback on this, in the beginning, we had some complaints from our subcontractors. Most of them were key on that subcontractors. It might not be just for employees, it's for those contingent workers, right? Most of them were about personal information, phone numbers, and emails. After we assured them that this is not used to collect any personal data, they've had a really overall higher level of readiness among the ones taking the test. It puts them under the job mode quicker in the mornings. We haven't had anyone come in yet and fail due to substance use and behavior. That is a very small percentage. But we've had a few that have told me they stayed home on a day when they knew they wouldn't pass. That's really key, right? Let's let people stay home if they know that they're out of sorts. Seems to produce a measurable amount of personal responsibility. It's a big deal, bringing to someone's attention that alertness matters, not just for job production, but for their own safety. It's tied well in with our safety culture that we try to bring to every job. And finally, it gives our managers more confidence when approaching someone they're concerned about. These are our little statements that have come back from a variety of our customers. Go to the next slide. So, did you know that the impact of impairment has on your company? Do you know that, right? Cognitive impairment tests allow for timely and intelligent countermeasures that tackle impairment in real time. And ultimately, by allocating 60 seconds at the beginning of each workday per employee and 30 cents to each worker per day, you can save a lot of lives and you can save money. I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Jacobs here to help wrap up.
Thanks, Jack. And I found out when I looked back at the two Jakes, actually I'm Harvey Keitel, so I'm no slouch either. So anyway, your supervisors are the ones who are the first line of defense in recognizing workplace impairment. And as an employer, you're responsible for a safe work environment. That goes for the physical, mental, and emotional needs of your employees. And the supervisors, their responsibilities should be to learn to recognize and respond to perceived impairment. HR is probably more key for enforcing impairment policies and procedures in a fair and consistent manner. And then both supervisors and HR can connect the employees to the pertinent resources like employee assistance, counseling, benefits, et cetera. And everybody should be responsible for communicating impairment safety information. Next slide, please. So this kind of ties into what Jack Nicholson said about the signs and symptoms, physical, cognitive, and performance. So for physical, you may see a shift in somebody's appearance. They might have tremors or an unsteady gait, delayed reaction time. Obviously, you may smell alcohol or marijuana on them. You may see them using. For cognitive, more the mental effects. They may have inappropriate verbal or emotional responses, irritability, memory loss, difficult behavior or change in behavior, confusion, isolation, distraction, and you can also judge it by their performance over a time period, and that usually manifests as absenteeism, lateness, early departures, unexplained breaks from work. You may find that they're making errors in judgment and having decreased concentration. Their work performance is deteriorating, and they're basically losing the ability to perform the tasks that they had been able to perform more recently. Next slide, please. So this is one form that I took from NSC, but the internet has thousands of forms that you can get. Work Care has forms as well that we'd be happy to share with you. But basically, you want to document the employee's name, the manager's name, the observer name, the date and time of the incident, and then describe the incident. And again, it should be just the facts, ma'am. No opinions. Next slide, please. So what do you do when you've used the alert meter and somebody doesn't pass for the second time, and you have that conversation with the supervisor? Obviously, the first thing is to address the immediate safety concerns. If somebody's in an excavator and they're behaving abnormally, you shut the machine down, you take them off it, and you have them sit for a little bit. And what you're doing is trying to gather relevant information. Are there any witnesses to this behavior? What did they see? The supervisor should also document any objective signs of impairment using a checklist. Have a discussion with another supervisor or an HR rep and have them also make their own assessment using the same checklist. And you want to take all this stuff and prepare for the discussion with the employee. In the discussion, it shouldn't be punitive. It shouldn't be, aha, we got you. It should be, we care about your welfare. We care about safety at work. We observed you were swerving when you were walking. You've been falling asleep on the job, etc. Do you have any explanations for that? And then maybe there's a legitimate explanation. I know, Jeff, you had said one time that you were talking to an employer, and it just turned out that the person was up all night with their kid who was sick. And rather than it being a punitive moment, they basically just sent him home or put him in a non-safety sensitive position for the remainder of the day, and tragedy averted. So basically, you're going to need to make some actions after you've made your assessment. Maybe that's referring them to a physician, sending them for a drug test, sending them home, reassigning to a non-safety sensitive job or employee assistance as needed. And then as you go through the time afterwards, you want to follow up with the employee and see how they're doing. Next slide. So I wanted to finish with what I've been doing over the last 6 months. And it's really because of the pandemic, because we are given the opportunity to do this via telemedicine, but do virtual clinical testing. And this is really no different than how I've performed in-person testing. I'm basically going to take a medical history. I always ask for documented supervisor observations with the employee, and then I sit down and I talk to them and say, your supervisor or several colleagues witnessed this. Do you have an explanation for it? And so I get their side of the story as well. I do a medical history review where I'm finding out if they have any medical problems that could be the cause of it, such as medications or social history, drugs and alcohol. And then I do a physical exam. And it's more of a functional and neurocognitive evaluation. So I can do range of motion and strength testing via video. I can check for alertness, awareness, mental functioning, and following directions. And I can do specific neurological tests. And the next slide starts to go into some of these tests that I do. So one of the tests is called a Romberg test. It tests balance. And basically, I'm going to have somebody stand with their feet together. Their arms can be at their sides or across chest. I have people stand with their arms 90 degrees to their body, 30 seconds, and I'm observing them with their eyes open and then closed. And people fail if I notice swaying, loss of balance, or hopefully I'm never going to see this, a fall. Usually if you're swaying, they're like, that's it, I'm done. Next slide, please. I also do what are called cerebellar neurological tests, because the cerebellum at the brainstem is responsible for balance, and it's tests for coordinated movements. And that's basically having the person with their arms outstretched and just touching their finger to their nose rapidly. And then it's different when your eyes are closed. One of the few balance tests that I can actually do. And then I'm also adding, you saw there when in the video, when Tanner, the employer, was talking about what New Jersey's doing, having something called a WIRE, a workplace impairment recognition expert. That's based on police traffic stops. And basically, the police will test you in 3 different ways. They're looking for nystagmus, and I don't think the screen is in good enough detail to look at my eye movements. But basically, I'm going to have somebody follow my finger with their eyes. And so if I'm going this way, the eyes should be moving and tracking that way. And if you see this jerking movement like that, that's what nystagmus is. I'll also have people stand on one leg for 30 seconds and then stand on the other for 30 seconds. I have a peripheral neuropathy, so I'm not going to embarrass myself on screen and show you. But I tend to not do well with this balance test. But again, this is indicative of some type of impairment. It's not indicative necessarily for alcohol or drugs. It's basically indicative for some type of impairment. And then finally, the walk and turn test, or basically the walk the white line test, where you're going to take 10 steps, 1 foot in front of the other, and then turn and walk back. And any loss of balance or swaying, hopping, anything like that is noted as a failure. So if you can go to the next slide, Alexis. So basically, I think there are a lot of opportunities, really interesting paths that we can go down in dealing with something as narrow as simply marijuana, or more broadly as workplace impairment. And I really hope that we can move beyond drug testing as a primary means of determining employee impairment. You've seen the alert meter, one of the advanced screening assessment tools. There are other competitors to Jeff, and they have good products as well. There are also products that are going down the road of looking at breathalyzers for marijuana. I've looked at those. Again, I think they're reasonable ways to handle the problem, but the issue is not everybody is high on marijuana. And then the most important thing is, if you suspect or have evidence of impairment, you have to act immediately to prevent incidents, injuries, and fatalities. So I think that's it. I think we have one more slide for questions, Karen.
Yes, we do. Then thank you very much. Just a reminder, please submit your questions using the Q&A function. We have a few minutes left. The first question is, I think it comes from Jeff Cease's section. If information is collected that isn't used, why collect it in the first place?
We don't. So I want to be really clear, because I'm not sure the root of this question. We never collect any health data whatsoever. The only information that is contained in the system is the person's name, who they report to, and their job function. That's the only thing we put in the system. The reason we want to know who they report to is so we know who to send the notifications to. But we don't collect any other information.
Okay. Oh, we're getting a couple more questions. How many times does it take to establish a baseline on an alert meter?
Yeah, that's a great question. Basically, the rules are that we need 10 tests to establish a rudimentary baseline. And most people, when they implement this, their first week of use, they encourage their employees to take it at the beginning of the day, again, maybe after the lunch break and at the end of the day. And if we do that, we can usually get baselines established in about 4 days. And then there's a period of time where we create additional statistical relevancy. But normally by about the end of the second week, people are accustomed to it. They've learned how to play the game, and you've got baselines that are sufficient to start to do that top level analysis.
Okay, and to clarify that first question, the follow-up is you had indicated pushback from subcontractors due to the collection of email and phone.
Yeah, again, I should be more clear on that. The only time we collect an email or phone number, and we want to make sure it's the company email, not a personal email, and a phone number is the phone number being for the people that would receive notifications. So if I manage 20 people, if one of my 20 people struggles with the game, then I want a notification to come back to me. So that can come back to my company email. And if I want, I can put my mobile number in there, or if it's a company supplied phone, then I can put my company phone number in there so that those notifications can come to me as a text message. But it's only the managers that we collect that information. For the workforce, all we need is their name. And in many cases, we don't even need their name. If we have their employee ID, that might be all we need. And we don't even need to put their name in the system.
Okay. Has the alert meter been used successfully on multi-employer work sites like construction where there's a significant transient workforce?
Yeah, it certainly has. We do work in the construction industry and in the mining industry where we get a lot of transient employees in. And for whoever put that question out there, we'd love to dig a little bit deeper with you on that, as that's an area where we're doing continuous product improvement to effectively reduce or eliminate the baseline requirement for somebody that is coming on site just for a day or 2 days. It would involve a slightly longer evaluation, but that's one of the things that's on the very forefront of our development side. And I think we've got some really good solutions there.
And one of our sharp-eyed attendees just pointed out that I made a typo in your email, which should be safety, not safety.
Thank you. Yeah,
So I'll correct that when we post this. Sorry about that.
You bet.
Find the fine print. Let's see. Let me see what else. Is this service available in Canada?
It is.
Or in French?
In French, yes. We're a global provider. We have customers in the US, Canada, South America, Peru, Chile, Brazil. We've got clients literally all over the globe. And for playing the game and taking the test, it's language independent because it's just shapes. But for the few words that are in there, we support a whole host of languages, including Bahasa and some things that you wouldn't expect. So yeah, it's very internationally based.
Okay, yeah, I know you use it in mining. So, and you were in, lots of different languages in Africa, for example.
Yeah, we have lots of mine
so
sites in South Africa.
Here's a question for Dr. Jacobs. Should supervisors be trained to recognize symptoms? Can work care identify good training programs?
Sure. So the National Safety Council has a 1 hour online training that I did. Work care is also available to work with our employers to develop something as well.
Hey, we have time for one last question, and I just want to remind everyone that if you have more questions about the services, the virtual exams, and the alert meter, please just write to us. You can write to info@workcare, and I can forward it to the Jeffs, or you can use the email or phone numbers on this slide with the T back in safety. One last question. A lot of people are using sleep apps to measure their quality of sleep. So how would that correlate with what you might find out using the alert meter to assess your level of fatigue?
I really love that question because that's a key factor of what we do. A lot of people are using sleep apps or Fitbits or Garmin's to track sleep and fitness and heart rate. but none of those apps track your cognitive acuity. And so we really do bring a new element to that whole concept of personal feedback. And we get answers. We had a union guy recently that came to us and said, you know, I was really hesitant to use this thing because I was afraid that Big Brother was going to be watching me. Well, they're not. Nobody's getting fired. You know, we're having really good conversations. But for me personally, what I like about it is when I come to work every day, I check my equipment. I walk around and I make sure that the chains are right and the equipment's good to go. But until I started using this, I never thought of testing or checking my brain, which is, you know, obviously one of the most important pieces of equipment that I've got, right? So yeah, it really ties in with that concept, and people that are using, you know, various devices that are on their wrist to do different things really adapt to this quickly, and they get pretty excited about it.
Great. Well, we're out of time. I want to thank you, Dr. Jacobs and Jeff Cease, for joining us today, and to all of you in our audience. And we're taking a little break from webinars over the summer, but we may have one in July and one in August, but for sure in September. So you'll be seeing more from us in the coming weeks. Thank you very much for joining us, and be safe.
Thank you all. Bye now.
Thank you.